So I'm so delighted to be here. Chicago is a place close to my heart because I spent 2 summers studying improv comedy at Second City and Cross Currents way back when. And so although I'm going to read my lecture today, hopefully I'll throw in a little improv just to keep things light because I have a lot to say, so I am going to read it. I want to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival for including me in this. It's really rare that scholars get a chance to share their hard-earned research with a general audience, and it's really delightful to be able to share a story that I've massaged a little bit in a Chicago direction from my book for you guys. And I want to thank the Terra that has supported so many different periods in my career and provided really interesting and exciting opportunities to think about American art in the broadest possible context. And I'm grateful to them for supporting me, a scholar who works on the border between Native America and Anglo-America and really helps us, they allow me to help think about what American really is. So today I'm talking about unpacking the Indian corner. In 1903, the magazine The Papoose published 7 photographs of the Indian corner installed in cartoonist and publisher Joseph Udo Kepler's Manhattan home. The photographs reveal 3 connected spaces: a large den that included a desk and seating area, a small alcove with a daybed, and a connecting hall dominated by a glass case. Each space teems with Native American artifacts accented by simple furnishings. The Papoose photographs of Kepler's display document objects drawn from a wide variety of Native American nations. On one wall of the study, the rounded forms of the southwestern basket plaques mingle with dangling beaded bags gathered from Plains tribes. The other wall bears a collection of Haudenosaunee or Iroquois false face masks. Navajo blankets cover the floor and several pieces of furniture, their contrasting geometric patterns providing a dazzling display. And a print of a Sioux warrior is wedged into the corner. Let me see if I have a second picture of this place. So just giving you a bit of a sense of the Victoriana in this northern Manhattan home. In other photographs, we can see a hearth surrounded by clubs, arrows, masks, and Hopi trays, a standing case filled with more Plains beadwork, and an alcove appointed in a similar fashion to the main room. Kepler's collection was not unique. The Indian corner was a widespread home decoration fad at the time. Photographs of other Indian corners from contemporary publications reveal Kepler's collection as elaborate but typical. So here you can possibly just see a small collection of baskets and one headdress photograph above them. This is the Illinois version. Owners of Indian corners ranged from people of modest means who kept a few items on a shelf, as can be seen in this image, to large-scale collectors such as Kepler, many of whom accumulated valuable and important pieces that later became the core of museum collections across the country. This, for example, is the amazing Indian corner of Edward Everett Hare, and it became the cornerstone of the Native American collections here at the Newberry Library. Indian corners routinely included handicrafts from diverse materials as well as diverse cultural origins. And this diversity is reflected in a 1904 article on the decorating fad, which described a room thus: a Winnebago curtain drapes an ample doorway, an Iroquois basket stains the wall with brilliant color, and one of Navajo weave conceals a couch. A graphic representation of an Indian is the last piece of the Indian corner. It's usually a calendar, a photograph, or perhaps a framed print. Why did this home decorating trend emerge at the beginning of the 20th century? What attracted urbanites like Kepler and Hare to such objects? In this talk, I will recount the history of the Indian corner, linking its popularity with collectors' desire to reconcile themselves with the changes brought about in their world by the rapid modernization of the time. I will focus on some aspects of modernity illustrated in the Indian corner: collecting as a modern practice, the importance of primitivism as a modern feeling and an influence on modern art, and finally, how we might connect the Indian craze to the emergence of a modern Native American identity. So, you get to all think about yourselves as moderns in this talk. At an event associated with the theme of journeys, that's the theme of the Humanities Festival this year, it's likely that you would be, sorry, there's another Indian corner. And there's the picture of the person, and we'll come back to this one. But I wanted to show a slide like this, because this is probably what we think of when we think of journeys in Native American art. We think of tourists going out west and purchasing objects directly from Native Americans. And this is just an example from the Santa Fe Railroad, probably taken around the 19-teens. But the Indian Corner actually predates widespread tourism in the Southwest. And although Indian traders were involved in providing urban consumers with native objects, they worked through outposts in major cities, including department stores and specialized boutiques called Indian stores. So the journey in my talk is about a journey undertaken by objects rather than a journey undertaken by people. They are not so much souvenirs as objects with stories of their own to tell. Here's a photograph of a display of blankets for sale, Navajo blankets for sale, in the window of Marshall Fields in 1899. According to an advertisement in House Beautiful, Fields was the source of, quote, baskets, weapons, pottery, pipes, bead and porcupine embroidery, and many other interesting and decorative articles, handiwork of the Sioux, Apache, Winnebago, Chippewa, Moki, and Maricopa Indians. Here in Chicago, Fields had competition in this sale from Schlesinger and Mayer's department store and an outpost of the Fred Harvey Company, a dealer affiliated with the Santa Fe Railroad, which set up a business in the Auditorium building in 1903. New Yorkers were treated to regular sales of Native American goods at Macy's and Wanamaker's, both department stores, and residents of Washington, D.C. could visit Woodward's and Lathrop for their needs, and citizens of Boston, Philadelphia, Seattle, and Southern California had commercial sources in the center of their downtown areas for native art as well. Thus, encounters with Native American art were not in dusty backwaters, but in the most sophisticated urban spaces of the time. And in these spaces, American Indian art was marketed using the most up-to-date strategies of the day. This department store interior, just to give you a bit of a sense of the same horror vacui that exists in Kepler's collection being quite typical of the way in which these displays were happening in commercial spaces. Historian William Leach has explained the use of new technologies such as electric lighting, elevators, plate glass cases and displays enhance the excitement and the modernity of the shopping experience in these emporia. Displays within department stores offered a spectacle. Employees arranged goods to give an impression of luxury and abundance. They were piled and stacked so that they almost seemed to be falling over, and customers could come, spotting them from afar, and be attracted across a room by texture and color and a need to touch and interact with them. And as I'll explain further below, such displays encouraged viewers to seek out experiences that held visual pleasures independent of moral or narrative meanings. It just felt good to interact with this stuff. Should I wait while you look at every single item for sale in the store? I think we already started a little late. At the time, let's see, I think I'd go back to a department store. So let's go back to Wanamaker's. At this time, department stores offered a wide array of goods, from clothing and furniture to food, sewing supplies, and plants. Inexpensive wares were presented alongside pricey luxuries, including artistic ceramics and silver, and even oil paintings. Department stores were intercultural marketplaces, weaving together foreign and domestic, rare and quotidian, high and low. John Wanamaker's New York store, shown here, at the time the largest department store in the nation, listed its Native American objects along other exotic wares. One advertisement from 1897 reads, "In preparation for exhibition, antique textiles, some notable pictures, Navajo blankets and curios." Wanamaker's store took advantage of the increased global trade of the time to offer wares from a variety of cultures. His store boasted halls dedicated to Egypt, Greece, and the Near and Far East, all of whose stock changed regularly with the arrival of new shipments from distant ports, which were duly noted in newspaper ads. New shipments from Alaska or the Southwest were similarly noted in the papers. So far, I've established a seamless integration of native objects alongside other commodities being sold in cities at this time. And why is this important? Because it connects indigenous objects to an important social transformation of the time. the training of Americans to be consumers and the rise of the notion that shopping is an act of self-creation. Here's an ad for an Indian corner, and I just want you to notice what it says. It says, an Indian corner in your home adds to the artistic effect. So the assumption is that you want your home to have an artistic effect. Not that you want it to keep the snow off your head or have enough beds for all the people who live there, but that it also needs to have an artistic effect, presumably to impress the people who come over, right? William Leach has traced the origins of shopping to the department stores, to the rise of the department stores that emerged at the late 19th century. Prior to this, people went to the store to fill their needs. Clerks generally retrieved items from behind the counter. You would say, I need 6 nails. The clerk would run in the back, get 6 nails, bring them forward, put them in a bag, and you would go home. With the increased sale of manufactured and luxury goods, or fancy goods, as they were called, stores changed to inspire people to purchase things they didn't need. Store interiors became more elaborate and elegant and encouraged women to have prolonged shopping trips. Eventually, and perhaps some of you have indulged in some of the remnants of these things, department stores had restaurants, lecture halls, meeting rooms offered to women's social organizations, so they never ever had to leave the department store to fulfill all of the activities of their day. Perhaps you are familiar with Theodore Dreiser's novel, Sister Carrie, in which the heroine's moral downfall begins when she enters a department store and begins longing for the beautiful things on display. To obtain them, she turns her back on the values with which she'd been raised: hard work, self-restraint, humility, modesty, patience, and instead engages in all kinds of shenanigans just to get what she wants. Dreiser was offering a comment on a change in modern character that accepted the growth of cities and the spread of commercial culture. That accompanied the growth of cities and the spread of commercial culture. His book is concerned with the transition from creating a sense of oneself based on what one does, which was the pre-modern notion of identity, to your identity based on what you consume, on how you demonstrate what you do with the capital that you create by working. Now, to create a desire for something one didn't necessarily need, department stores not only sold items, but helped teach consumers how to use them in the way that this ad does, offering showrooms that served as models for home decorators. So the Indian corner is directly connected to recreating a display that one might see in a store, as are other decorative venues. For example, Marshall Field's Carpet Hall was displaying Near Eastern carpets, Oriental carpets, with hanging textiles and desert plants and other kinds of things like hookahs to create an Orientalist interior, with the suggestion that that cozy corner would look fantastic, perhaps on a slightly smaller scale, in your home parlor. And this is an illustration from L. Frank Baum. Perhaps you know that the author of The Wizard of Oz was first best known as a decorator of commercial spaces, and in fact, particularly well sought out for his ability to create great show windows. And there's a fantastic connection in the history of art and the history of department store window organization. There's a Jasper Johns Rauschenberg moment in this wonderful history as well. But Baum starts this off, and he actually publishes a book at the turn of the century, a guidebook for how to do decorative display effectively. And so this is his display, which presumably at the end of which somebody's just going to buy one of those pillows. But look at all of the work that's gone to help you understand that you're not just buying a pillow. You're buying a pillow lifestyle, right? You're buying, this is the West Elm of its moment. And this is the moment when that really comes into being. So, ads for goods at this time often describe potential uses for the objects on sale. So with native objects, you see Navajo rugs being suggested as the perfect thing for a den or a porch, or using a sweetgrass basket made by California natives as the perfect thing for collecting your Easter eggs, or holding your sewing, or the calling cards of your visitors. Again, not that you didn't already have something in your house to collect Easter eggs in, but you've got to up the ante this year by having a Pima basket for that purpose. Now the culture, this is the one paragraph where I mentioned French theory, because I figure this is the academic day, and you need to get your money's worth, so I'm gonna sound theoretical, and then I'll go back to making jokes. The culture of consumption introduced a notion of taste as a signifier of social class. In the late 19th century, Thorstein Veblen invented the term conspicuous consumption, which was the wasteful consumption of goods not to meet physical needs, but as a visible sign to others of your wealth and power. The standard set by what Veblen calls the leisure class then became the standard to which middle and lower classes held themselves, and upon which their reputation as being socially acceptable, tasteful, and modern and up-to-date would be based. As sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has explained, this notion of taste has served to naturalize the elite status of those with power to consume more by masking the relationship based on discernment. So this is another aspect of modern identity, is what your ability to buy the latest iPhone is a sign of your social status rather than your ability to fix your own sink or do some other things that we might in a strict attitude towards the world find useful in a more elemental way. And this is really creates a slightly different understanding of who elite people are, right? Because they're the people who command not only money, but the authority to make it look like the choices of how to spend their money are good choices. The people who become members of the Chicago Humanities Festival, right, are demonstrating good taste and are social leaders and are looked up to by all the other members of the community, right? So this is what's emerging in Bourdieu's argument. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is consuming Native American art in this period is good taste. It becomes good taste, and it becomes good taste because of its ability to connect to all of these other ideas going on in time that have nothing to do with Native America. Now, at this point, I'd like to introduce the second modern aspect of the Indian corner, and I just want to see what my next slide is. Primitivism. The second modern idea. Now, when art historians use the word primitivism, we usually conjure up something like this, right? But Pablo Picasso's proto-cubist paintings from the first decade of the 20th century, which depict how this artist's interest in non-European art could be a source for new ideas about how to depict the body and organize representational space. So this is the famous painting that started it all, and you can see evidence that Picasso visited the Trocadero Museum, which was an anthropology museum in Paris, and that he took great interest in African masks. And you can see that particularly in this mask here, which covers the face of this woman, giving her a kind of brutal appearance, but also allowing Picasso to begin to think about, why do I need to make a nose only from the same perspective that I'm depicting the eyes? Maybe I could create facets and play with the representation in a non-realistic way. So it's really suggested in paintings like this that he was inspired by going to these museums and seeing people who made artistic choices not from a Western tradition. And I want to think a little bit in a minute about how Native American art was used to help usher in modernist ideas about art making, composition, style. But first I want to think a little bit more about what drove Picasso to the Ethnography Museum in the first place, which was a desire to encounter objects from what he perceived as a non-modern and thus more authentic culture, or perhaps several. And I want to do this by going back to the Indian corner, getting us out of France, because I'm an Americanist, and because the Indian corner allowed a similar encounter to be staged, an encounter with objects from outside of modern culture that were valued in a similar way to how Picasso valued the Trocadero. And here I'm bringing back Baum's cozy corner because I want us to see that the Indian corner is a kind of cozy corner, and I'm going to talk now a little bit about cozy corners more broadly. Cozy corners are a type of domestic space that developed in the mid-19th century that was designed to offer an opportunity to experience another world without traveling. It is really literally contrasting the space inside the home with the workaday exterior world. While city life was becoming increasingly standardized and distanced from nature, developments in lighting allowed people to organize their workdays around the clock, not the sun. Trains and other industrialized modes of transportation sped up and depersonalized movement through space. Telephones, pneumatic tubes, and improved postal service reduced the actual need for in-person encounters between people in the course of their commercial transactions. So as all of these developments happened in the work world, leisure time became increasingly charged with providing a balance to that, an antidote. And the home was charged with offering the human interactions, sensual pleasures, and natural experiences that the routines of modern life had otherwise denied. And this is why there was a great hunger for objects in the home that were perceived as having come from a culture that never experienced those ruptures, breaks, and alienations that characterized modernity. The first cozy corners were outfitted with pillows and textiles from the Middle East, reflecting an association with a region of comfort and luxury, right? The Orientalist ideas of the 19th century thought everybody in the Middle East was some kind of self-indulgent sultan being waited on by half-naked ladies all day. And lives that were guided by their individual choices, by their passions, certainly not by a time clock, or a need to pay the rent, or a need to get across town in the rain. This was a great space to sit home and kind of relax and escape from those concerns. Because of the choices a homeowner could make about how to furnish this kind of space, cozy corners were thought as places to cultivate a sense of individuality. So you wouldn't only have a cozy corner, you'd have your own cozy corner with your own choices, your own styles, representing your own color scheme, the level of pile that you find best on your oriental carpets, the round poofy pillows or the square pillows. All of these choices demonstrating your individual decisions and taste. So cozy corners provided casual spaces for familial interaction that were filled with objects with stimulating forms and textures and exotic associations that epitomized this link between the home and the escape from modern urban culture. This phenomenon was influenced by the British critics John Ruskin and William Morris, which spurred what's come to be known as the arts and crafts movement. I was just at the Art Institute this morning, a whole room on the arts and crafts movement, so I'm sure you all know already about it. But the arts and crafts movement basically suggested that exposure to simple, well-designed, handmade furnishings in the home could not only help assuage what Ruskin called, quote, the anxieties of the outer life, but could also help develop character, personal fortitude, provide the kind of respite that would allow one to re-emerge into that public space with a sense of self, of purpose, and of determination. The arts and crafts movement praised cultures perceived as untainted by modern industrialism, celebrating the craftsmen of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, or those from rural areas such as Ireland. And handcrafted exotic objects from Asia, including paisley shawls, Arabian carpets, and Japanese screens, were also brought in under this rubric as authentic and more healthful than the machine-made bibelots of Western culture. This rhetoric also facilitated the market for Native American objects. And if we look at the Indian corner, we can see a way in which these corners are designed quite literally to offer a wealth of sensual pleasures, to take one out of one's head and automatic reactions to things and make one corporeal and responsive to stimuli in the moment. And I'm going to go back to, this is the image that I skipped over quickly before, so now you can really spend some time looking at it. And I want to think, for example, about a homo basket. So this is a basket style that was quite popular in Indian corners, produced by the Californians of northern Marin County. And you can see here, just by reading the materials from which this basket's made, that it offers, in and of itself, incredible sensual pleasure. So this is a basket that's made out of willow. And I don't know how many of you have handled a Native American basket lately, or any handmade basket lately, but the freshness of roots, the smell of a handmade basket lingers long after it's made. So we have a texture of the weaving, but we also have the aroma of something that brings nature inside the home. Then we have the texture of these shiny shells that have been foot on the surface so that even from across the room in a dimly lit interior, you have this reflective quality that's catching your eye. And each of these discs is round but not perfectly round. These are not machine-made, interchangeable beads, but rather handcrafted ones so that you can take a real interest in looking at them closely and thinking about how they're put together. And then the pièce de la résistance are these quail topknot feathers that have been woven in while the artist is making this basket to stick out. And if you're ever in the presence of one of these Pomo gift baskets, what you know is that just breathing in the room sets these topknot feathers just fluttering a little bit. And as you walk, the reverberations of people walking across the room. So they're almost alive. And if we were doing a lecture on Pomo baskets, I'd tell you that they really are alive and they need to be fed. There's all kinds of stuff going on with them. But in this context, that just reaches out to us. And I want you to think about the display here. And I'm particularly interested in this collection in the way in which some baskets are tipped up on their side and some are sitting on their bottoms and some are hanging, reaching out into our space, just kind of asking us to touch them. They seem to almost be falling, so we want to come in and catch them and maybe even rearrange them, think about the way in which the display might go another way. And this is something that I noticed in my work. Indian corners are almost always shot into the corner. They're almost always shot on this angle so that the objects really are reaching out to you. And I think it gives us a real illustration of how tactile and inviting and interactive these spaces are. And when you think about what it's like to walk down a city street where you don't want to interact, right? Part of modernity is that you're part of an anonymous crowd. We put in our earbuds. We don't want to interact with the people around us. We need to kind of streamline and become part of a mass. The home then becomes this place where you slow down and you interact and you have all of these feelings and all of these choices to make. Which basket am I going to pick up today? So that's really part of the primitivism, right? Is that this stuff is not from our machine world. It's from some other world. And it requires that I be a person with a body, that I be a person with senses, that I be a person who makes choices. And this, I think, is an aspect of the primitivism that we see in this work. And now I have to skip ahead because I just improvised my next paragraph. So give me a second, please. So this turn away from contemporary industrialization might seem to be anti-modern, but I think it can also be seen as creating a relationship between a modern person able to make choices and a pre-modern world under his or her control. So I just said that for Pomo people, this basket might be one kind of thing. But for the person who collects this basket, it doesn't really matter what a Pomo person thinks it is, right? They endow it with their own idea of what it means. And I did bring in just some Navajo blankets again to sort of get you to think about particularly this illustration of a chief blanket being worn, to think about these objects as things that you would envelop yourself in your home, right? That you would do something more than just cover your floor. There are materials that have weight, and again, hopefully not too bad, but maybe a little smell or a little hay gets stuck in the wool. These connections to a natural world. So let me come back to another one of these. So in assembling an Indian corner, the collector got the excitement of making contact with another world while having the knowledge of control, because their own lives are not guided by the conditions of a subsistence lifestyle. The pleasurable encounters of primitivism rely on being outside of the primitive culture looking in. Collecting primitive objects involves praise, but it's praise for things that the so-called civilized culture values rather than things that people in the so-called primitive culture perhaps value. Although there's great points of connection, right? Because these are beautiful objects in the eyes of both their makers and their consumers. And they're well made, and they are high quality. And there are also some real points of connection. And one can certainly imagine that not every aspect of the lives of the owners of Indian cultures was industrialized, that the mothers in the family still mended their children's clothing and they could appreciate good stitch work when they saw it, or that these things reminded them of values that perhaps they didn't have enough time to really do themselves, but that once upon a time they did a sampler or needlepoint or something like that. Okay. So just to sum this up, let's throw in a little more theory. Walter Benjamin, the fantastic German cultural critic, really summed up what collecting objects is. He wrote that the collector is someone, quote, with a relationship to objects which does not emphasize their functional utilitarian value, that is, their usefulness, but studies them and loves them as the scene, the stage of their fate. The most profound enchantment for the collector is the locking of individual items within a magic circle in which they are fixed as the final thrill, the thrill of acquisition that passes over them. So, I could talk here at length about how such collecting practices are engaged in other kinds of power dynamics, like the American colonial power over Indian people at this period, and think about particularly how collecting and the establishment of our museums coincided with the reservation system and other kinds of things. But I think that I just want you to think a little bit about who has the power to decide why something's valuable for this. And now I want to think a little bit as well about this piece of the Indian corner, because I think it expresses these power dynamics in a really useful way. These kinds of pictures that I've been mentioning before are called Indian portraits, and they come in a variety of mediums and sizes and styles. So the and they were actually actively marketed to collectors. This is Kepler's version. And so the Sioux man on Kepler's wall resembles the straightforward, almost ethnographic busts of the nationally known painter Elbridge Eyre Burbank, whose work is extensively represented in the Newberry collection. They also have some at the Art Institute, and whose work was advertised in the Chicago-based magazine Brush and Pencil, which included color copies of his portraits that you could cut out and frame and hang on your wall at home. The magazine published other Burbanks in subsequent issues and also offered copies via mail order. Prints weren't the only form of Indian portraiture. Photographers such as Frank A. Reinhardt vended their wares through advertisements, and art dealers and Brush and Pencil also promoted so-called Indian calendars like the one on the right, proclaiming that one of them was the sensation of the year. In keeping with their title, Indian portraits were usually annotated with the name of the sitter, but they tend to position that sitter as passive. Chief Blue Eagle in Burbank's painting, for example, doesn't attempt to engage the viewer's gaze, but instead looks away, as do the subjects of the portraits on other walls. These isolated figures are usually depicted in traditional dress and engaged in timeless activity, such as caring for children, or doing nothing at all. In many ways, the Indian portraits are the key to the Indian corner, for this simulated presence of original makers and users of the objects of display highlights their assumed absence from modern domestic spaces. In other words, these guys are living in some mythical West, not in some modern domestic space. These are, I'm just looking at my clock and thinking I'm going to move forward. So I want to think about the way in which these portraits juxtapose two antithetical worlds. Now, with luck, I've convinced you that primitivism is a very modern thing. It's broadly shared by consumers working to come to terms with aspects of their conditions that they are anxious about by consuming cultures they imagine to be untainted by these troubles. But now I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about primitivism as an artistic movement, because I think that the blurb for my lecture said that, and because the Terra folks care a lot about art, and so do I. And what I want to stress here is that modern artists of the early 20th century studied tribal objects in an attempt to infuse their own work with some of the authenticity that they ascribe to primitive life. So in addition to learning about how things should look in primitive art, they also wanted to think about themselves as being primitive. They wanted to bring that kind of contact and connection that somebody might have with holding up a pomo basket into their work as creators so that their objects too could provide that kind of break. So one of the pervasive definitions of modernist art is that it's art that attempts to break through a distancing of art and life and really connect in a moment and animate a moment and make the viewers aware in a vital kind of way. So I want to show you this pot by a Hopi Toa Potter named Nampeo to give you a sense of what artists might have gotten, how artists might have gotten excited about this work. Nampeo is often identified as the first Native American artist to be known by name, and whose work was explicitly collected and valued because it was made by her. This isn't exactly true, but it's not far wrong. What I want you to notice are some of the formal qualities of the work. She shaped this jar entirely by hand with coils of clay, no wheel, polished it to the shine without glazes, and painted the decorations with a brush made from a few strands from a yucca plant. I don't think anyone can deny the skill necessary for such an accomplishment. Moreover, the conception and execution of the decorative motif is equally impressive. She shaped a vessel with elegant proportions and situated her painting in a band that stretches just over the hip of the jar, giving it a strong sense of presence and expansiveness. The motifs inside this decorative register are balanced but dynamic. They bend and point in different directions, keeping the eye moving. The composition blends bold form and minute detail in a way that rewards both a cursory glance and careful scrutiny. If you encountered this bowl in an Indian corner, you would truly be invited to stop what you were doing and pick it up, rotating it in space to get a sense of how beautifully it all fits together. And picking it up would also give you the tactile pleasures of interacting with Pueblo pottery, which is uncannily lightweight and smooth without being perfect in its surface. For artists interacting with indigenous material culture at this time, pots like Nampeyo's offered many important lessons. For example, the fact that she built her wares by hand reminded artists of the importance of mastering their materials. This is one aspect of the formalism that's a hallmark of modernist painting. In her ability to meet the challenge of placing an abstract design elegantly within compositional space, was related to a contemporary interest in thinking about how the design or decorative quality of work differed from the needs of a representational or narrative or subject matter. Art historian Stella Tilliard notes that one of the major contributions to modernism that the decorative arts movements made was offering a new formalist language. This vocabulary is abundantly employed in discussions of Native American art in mainstream magazines at the turn of the century. In 1908, Lila Mecklin published an article in International Studio urging artists to study Native American collections because these designs may or may not have symbolic meaning, but they unquestionably possess character and give aesthetic delight. Instead of symbolism, she looks at this work as a model of decorative effects and excellence of design. And this is something that we could do if we had lots and lots of time left with somebody like Gauguin, who's not only depicting people in Polynesia, but also learning from the way in which carving of Maori people has a flatness and a sense of rhythm and a decorative sense of repetition in its forms that does something that competes for attention from the viewer. Color competes for attention with the viewer with any story that we might want to tell about what happened on the day of the god. And we might look for something like that, you can't really see this very well, I apologize, in something like a Northwest Coast carving as well, right? A Northwest Coast carving, you can play the find the frog or the bear game if you want to, but you can also notice, as the first scholars of Northwest Coast carving did, that all of this composition is made out of a few small forms, twisted, growing, shrinking, rotating in space. You have ovoids, you have U-shapes, and you have circles. And the artist has just done an incredible job of putting them together in a pleasing and engaging way. Now, Burbank, here's Burbank, illustrates this point beautifully in an article that he published in 1900, which is called In Indian Teepees, also published in the Chicago journal Brush and Pencil. And here's another Burbank, but I actually don't think his work lives up to the values that he's talking about, so I'm going to substitute a Robert Henry from the same time and with some similar concerns. In this article, he ascribed to Native Americans, quote, a high appreciation of the beauty of line and color, and no inconsiderable degree of dexterity in affecting artistic results, especially on purely decorative lines. Throughout the essay, Burbank creates an image of Native craftspeople as artists. The Apache chief Geronimo, for example, is praised for his fine eye for line and color. Other artists are praised for taking hours to work out designs, quote, after the manner of more civilized races, and patiently making alterations until they were satisfied. Burbank suggests that Native craftspeople find their inspiration in nature, but he stresses the human decision-making involved in their work. nature is viewed through different eyes, and different objects recommend themselves especially suitable for the purposes of design, he writes, adding that in addition to individual choice, artists follow regional and tribal traditions that he likens to, quote, so many different art schools. He puts it succinctly. In a word, both braves and squaws showed that they were essentially artists and that they studied for effect as rationally and as carefully as the artists of civilized communities. So I'm thinking about the way in which what we're seeing in Burbank's work is really in endowing Native American artists with the decision making that's essential to being modern artists, a way to flip that around and make natives a role model for modern artists. And that's really beautifully illustrated by Arthur Wesley Dow. And I'm going to actually start improvising now because I'm never going to finish if I read the rest of this lecture. But Arthur Wesley Dow is an art teacher well known for training many modernists such as Georgia O'Keeffe and Max Weber. And here's an example of his work. And I think you can see that he's engaging in some flatness and some decorative qualities in depicting this scene in a way that shows his great debt to Japanese art. So he was thinking about how Japanese artists solve compositional problems in a way different from, say, Italian Renaissance artists. And he shared these ideas in a book that was published in 1899 called Composition, a book that was used as a standard art textbook for much of the 20th century, in which artists are asked to solve formal problems, not problems of how to make something look like the thing that it's supposed to depict. So he asks people to think about harmonizing color, using positive and negative space, how to balance composition within different shapes of frames. And here's an illustration from it in which you can see, that some of the motifs that he's drawing seem to be drawn from Native American subjects. He's very global in the sources that he's using, and he's going to natural history museums just like Picasso is and looking at pottery decoration, looking at woven textiles from Peru, from Japan, from the Southwest, and bringing it into his classroom because these are artists who he feels have admirably solved compositional problems. He also makes his students make Native American art, to master materials, because the mastery of your materials is an essential component of modern art practice for him. So rather than working only on 2 dimensions, what happens if you have to build an abstract design using a Navajo loom? What happens if you have to think about making a form, a geometric form, building clay? These are some of his students at his summer school in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And you can see that he's actually borrowed objects, probably from the Peabody Museum, for them to use as role models. So I'm interested in the way in which this might relate to something like his student Max Weber's work. If you work really hard, you could probably see a Sioux feather bonnet there, but that's not really what I'm trying to call your attention to. I'm trying to call your attention to the fact that for Weber to think that this is a good painting requires giving up an idea that a depiction of rush hour shows every aspect of rush hour as it is observed, and instead solves the problem of conveying a sense of rush hour through color, through line, through the movement of paint across the surface, through a cramming of this frame with so much going on that you get that sense of not enough room and of being pushed places against your will, but through a language of abstraction. And I think these are the kinds of lessons that Native American art offered for Dow and his students. Now there's one more aspect of modernity that I want to share with you, and I will do it somewhat more quickly than I would have liked because I know that it's important to have a little bit of time for Q&A. And that's the modernity of Indian people, because all of the discussions that I've been talking about suggest that Native American art existed at this period as a kind of screen on which non-natives could project a fantasy of primitive Indians that could sort of fulfill whatever their needs of being modern people are. But if we believed that, then we would be turning away from some of the realities that the very artists who are producing the work for Indian Corners are facing exactly those same struggles. They are exactly caught up in a moment of modernization. In fact, they're caught up in a moment of modernization at the hands of a federal government supervising Indian lives that might even exacerbate some of those experiences of dehumanization, of mechanization of lives, of a disempowerment and a loss of individuality. So in this period, there was an unprecedented American focus on assimilation. Federal law compelled attendance at Indian schools, both on reservation and in eastern locations far from home. And far from the corrupting influence of traditionalists at home. The Dawes Act of 1887 called for the dissolution of tribal territory, privatizing native claims to individual homesteads, and selling the so-called surplus off to non-natives. Religious and secular reservation reform projects pursued the goal of civilizing Indian people by immersing them in the English language, Christian religion, and Western notions of individuality. And as my book explains at greater length, Native American art was actually a traditional practice that was allowed to survive in this period when so many other practices were not allowed to survive. And the very reason that it was allowed to survive was that it was perceived as economically viable, that it was perceived as an aspect of Native culture that could be valued from outside Native culture without compromising the goal of civilizing them. So I want to look at just a little bit at some of these makers, and I'll just identify them for you very quickly. But here's Washoe basket maker Datsola Lee, or Louisa Kaiser. And Louisa Kaiser was in the employ of some traders in Carson City, Nevada, Abe and Amy Cohn, and they promoted her work not only through catalogs, but also by having her weave baskets in the window of their shop and taking her on vacation with them every summer to Lake Tahoe, where she would demonstrate her work in public. And they were constantly presenting her as an ignorant old woman making the art of her past. But she was also a wage employee, and in fact, the ability to devote so much of her time to making baskets allowed her to be an innovator. She is actually the inventor of this particular form of basket called the degekup, and she was able to command incredible sums for it because her work was so good. She had the time to become quite expert at this work. So even as she's being marketed as primitive, she is being very modern in her sense of an artist developing her work for a commercial market in response to feedback that she's getting in that environment. We might think a similar thing of Louise Hickox, a Northern California basket weaver who also innovated styles of basketry, entered into a private contract with her dealer, Grace Nicholson, so that all of her work was provided just to this one venue, a dealer who she felt treated her reasonably fairly. But as you can see in this picture, Hickox is by no means a primitive person. She's wearing the latest fashions, a beautiful Gibson girl hairdo. Her husband owns the first automobile in town and serves actually eventually as a magistrate. And because they have the automobile, they can kind of corner the market on selling her work because they can drive it all the way down to Sacramento to put it in the mail to the buyers. So they're participating and negotiating some of these transformations in the market, in production, in distribution, and in transportation. Here's Nampeo. Nampeo never learned English, was not as sophisticated a manipulator of this situation, and in fact, her wage work was to be an artist demonstrator in this place called Hopi House on the rim of the Grand Canyon next to El Tovar Hotel, where tourists could come and watch her work and then later buy her material in the gift shop there in the store. And what's interesting to me about Nampeo is that this contract was fully approved by the reservation agents in Hopi, and she was only able to go back and forth from home to see her family or to take care of sick relatives based on the permission given to her by her employers and by the government officials who controlled her life. This is an experience of the bureaucracy and anonymity and powerlessness of modern life par excellence. That the Indian Corner was designed to redress. I have a couple of more examples, but I don't necessarily want to go through all of them and use up all of our time. So I'm just going to go to this last picture, which I love. It's one of my favorite pictures. This is a Buffalo Bill Wild West performer who performed at the World's Columbian Exposition here in town. And what I love about this picture is that we're not seeing him in the show, we're seeing him on a break, walking across the fairgrounds, possibly on his way to see some amazing installation of Impressionist painting, or the dancing of the Dahomey people, or the latest developments in moving pictures. I want us to end in this lecture thinking about the fact that the modern urban spaces in which Native American objects existed because of the Indian Corner were also modern urban spaces in which Indian people were negotiating the very same aspects of modernity as those collectors. Thank you. Shout them out.
Does anybody have any questions? I'll come to you. And if we don't come to you yet, keep your hands up and we'll try and get to you as fast and as quick as possible.
Is the acceptance of non-modern art made possible by the conquest of these native people so they weren't considered a threat to white society?
Sure. And not only in our colonial context, right? That African art becomes acceptable in Europe once Africa has been successfully divided between European conquering countries. And this is pretty true of Australian art. Many of the colonial stories are ones in which it's actually called imperialist nostalgia by Renato Rosaldo, who, along with Mary Louise Pratt, who spoke this morning, was one of the kind of really important people in the Stanford anthropology department when I was a grad student. Imperialist nostalgia basically says once the conquest is over, then you can fetishize what you've just destroyed and pat yourself on the back for loving it, even though you knew it was inevitable that it had to be destroyed in the wake of progress. And so many of our museums are monuments to imperialist nostalgia. But fortunately, while they're not necessarily a military threat, Native American culture never disappeared the way that attitude would suggest and hope for.
Anybody have any more questions?
It's late.
All righty.
All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Thanks so much for coming.